Hello, everyone. Parenting with Pride. Welcome to our April webinar. As folks are coming in, feel free if you like. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. For those of you that I call you my regulars. I see you every month. Welcome back. If you'd like, you are welcome to in the chat. Put your name and where you're coming from. If you're here in Florida, I am coming from down south in Miami, the southern part of Florida, but we always love to see where everybody is, and we will get started in just a minute. I also want to remind folks that we do record this. I have permission from our great speakers to have this recorded. So if you know someone that wanted to join us tonight, or if there's something that you hear tonight and you want to share it with someone, it will be on our YouTube channel. It takes about a week to kind of clean it up and get it uploaded on there, but it will be on there. And all of our other webinars are on there as well. So if there's something that you heard about and you didn't get a chance to see it live, feel free to go to our YouTube channel, Parenting with Pride, and you'll be able to see that. Welcome, everyone. We're doing this on a Monday, and we don't usually do it on Monday. So I'm curious to see, end of the workday on a Monday, how many folks are tuning in. Although this is one of our most important webinars that we do every year. I think it's so important for us to understand what happened in the legislative session. That's why we called it Now What? Now that our session's over, although, right, surprise, maybe not over. But it's really important for us to understand what happened, what's going to, affect us, when it's going to go into effect, those kinds of things, because a lot of times we hear all the scary noise at the beginning of session, but we never really find out if things had amendments, that things changed, that they were made better, made worse. And so this is so important. Those of you that are here from PFLAG, if you're a PFLAG leader, this will be really great for you to have information to pass on to your members. PFLAG Miami is my chapter, and I did this almost exact presentation for them to make sure that they knew, because there's a lot of stuff that sounds real scary. And then when John Harris and Quinn tell me about it, I'm like, oh, not as bad as I thought. And I'd love to be able to pass it on to all of you. So with that, it is a couple minutes after 6. Folks are still coming in, but I want to make sure that we have time. So if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. We will have time at the end for a Q&A. And so if there's something that you hear, you may want to, jot it down. And at the end, we have the 2 top folks in Equality Florida. In Florida, anytime I have a question when it comes to anything with policy, these are the 2 people that I turn to. And so I am so honored that we have John Harris and Quinn here tonight with us to answer any questions. So it's really like having your own private session with the top policy people. So if you do have a question about something that you hear or something else pertaining to something policy in Florida or outside of Florida, we'll all do our best to answer that. So it is now 6:04. Let's get started. John Harris is our public policy director, and Quinn is our public policy manager. And like I said, they are an incredible team. For those of you who have joined us at Pride at the Capitol, I'm sure you have seen them going in every single committee hearing. If you follow it online, I just love how this team really shows up at every space, guides us, and I encourage you all to do Pride at the Capitol. It's so empowering, and they make sure that we have our talking points. So all the background preparation for Pride at the Capitol is really this team here. And so thank you both for being here. I am going to turn it over to you, John Harris, to get started. And again, everybody welcome, and feel free to put some questions in the chat, and we'll get to it at the Q&A.
All righty. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because we have some slides to facilitate our conversation. Can I just get a thumbs up? Folks can see that. All right. As Jennifer mentioned, Quinn and I are sort of the lead team on the ground in the Capitol for Equality Florida, and happy to talk about the 2026 legislative session. It was another grueling one. Um, for folks who have had the pleasure of joining us in Tallahassee or just following along in the work in a while, you know that they tend to be pretty grueling legislative sessions, but um, this one really did surprise us in some ways. I will say, coming into this legislative session, we were sort of cautiously optimistic about some of the dynamics, particularly coming out of the 2025 legislative session when we helped stop every anti-LGBTQ bill. And in fact, none of them even had a hearing in the House. So, given that none of them had a hearing, a number of the bills that we did focus on, which we'll talk about in a little bit, were familiar ones that we had fought before. The fact that this is the last session of a sort of waning DeSantis lame duck governorship, um, we were feeling more cautiously optimistic. Now, that's not a high bar in Florida. That basically means just harm avoided, while we would love to do more proactive work. Um, and at the outset, that did feel like sort of the rhythm that we were settling into. Um, and as we got into the thick of legislative session in like the third and fourth week, that really shifted quickly. And all of a sudden, in I think it was week 4, we saw as many bad bills put on agendas as we had seen get hearings in all of the 2025 legislative session. So, I mean, ultimately, where we ended, not to give you a spoiler, um, we did help stop or neutralize 4 out of the 5 anti-LGBTQ bills. That was still a tremendous win. And one of the other big policy fights that was happening simultaneous to legislative session and partially within legislative session was the fight on ADAP, the state's AIDS drug assistance program that the Department of Health had proposed massive sweeping cuts to. And we were able to secure some really important stopgap funding there. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the presentation as well. And while we were really disappointed that one of the anti-LGBTQ bills did pass, the anti-diversity in local government bill that we'll talk about in depth tonight, there were some really important carve-outs there. It is legislation that Quinn and I and all of you who've come up to join us in Tallahassee have actually been fighting for 2 years. It was reintroduced this session. And there were some really critical, important carve-outs in there. So it is not nearly as harmful and scary as it may sound at first blush, as Jennifer was saying. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Quinn to talk a little bit more just about sort of how we showed up in the Capitol this session.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean Harris, and hello, everyone. So, how we showed up and fought back, how were we able to defeat 4 to 5 expressly anti-LGBTQ bills? Well, for those of y'all who have been joining us in Tallahassee for the past couple of years, you may know that since 2024, we have run a 60-day mobilization program in the Capitol, which means we're bringing up folks from all across the state every single day of the legislative session because, it's only 60 days long. There's not much notice given when bad bills are placed on agendas. So it's really important to have folks able to get to Tallahassee. And so we do a lot of recruiting and relationship building, especially our organizing department throughout the year to really strengthen our relationships, strengthening our leadership pipeline programs with our equality captains in order to really bring folks up to Tallahassee during the legislative session. So by the numbers, the session was incredibly impressive. And in fact, we've really broken a lot of records year over year. So each year this slide just gets more impressive. So together we testified against bad bills in 35 committee hearings. We had just about maybe a little bit more than 475 meetings with lawmakers and legislative staff, which is huge, again, in just that 60-day window. 16,000 people sent over 300,000 emails to lawmakers utilizing our action alerts, which invite folks to contact their lawmakers about bad bills that are on our legislative slate. We drove phone calls to lawmakers during that, especially during those weeks that John Harris mentioned, where so many of our bad bills were placed on agendas. And we drove over 3,000 calls during a span of just a couple weeks. And then for our big Pride at the Capitol event, this year we actually did it bigger than ever before. And so typically we have our kickoff week as one of the first early weeks of the legislative session, and we have a 2-day kickoff event to start that 60-day mobilization program. But this week we did 2 full kickoff weeks because last year we were just at capacity, almost, almost 425 folks joined us in Tallahassee. We had, filled every reservable room to capacity. We needed to expand. So this year we did it over 2 weeks, and we had over 400 people join us for those 2 weeks. And then the 60 days plus, we had 300 people join us in the second week of our Pride at the Capitol mobilization program for the third annual Let Us Live March, which is our trans rights march that we kind of co-facilitate with a lot of other trans-led organizations in Florida. So very impressive numbers, and it's because of these numbers, because folks showed up and joined us in Tallahassee, that we were really able to defeat these bad bills. Next slide, please. And so this is just a little snapshot, as Sean Harris mentioned. There were 5 expressly anti-LGBTQ bills, but our policy portfolio is, it obviously touches on all the LGBTQ issues, but it's also broad and it includes education issues, reproductive health issues, all sorts of healthcare issues, and of course, gun violence prevention work. So these graphics kind of snapshot some of our top priority bills. You'll see, I think it's on everyone's left, the expressly anti-LGBTQ bills with the outcomes, and then on the right, the additional high priority bills. Some of these we'll talk about a little bit more in depth this evening. Some, like the new barriers to voting bill and the police state bills, we won't cover as in depth, but if anyone has questions on those, especially those 2 that passed, we are happy to take them at the end. But this is just kind of gives you a taste of everything that we were up against. Especially, I'm looking down at the bottom of the right-hand side, and I'm looking at that abortion bounty law, restricting family and surrogacy. Like, these are bills that we had not seen previously. And so while we're used to continually combating the kind of tired old anti-LGBTQ attacks, this year we did see a little bit of an expansion in the bills that we were fighting against. But I think we'll get into the bills, the anti-LGBTQ bills that we worked hard to at least, if not defeat, mitigate the harm to shortly. So John Harris.
All right. Thanks, Quinn. So the first of those anti-LGBTQ bills, the one that passed and the one that is becoming the biggest focus for us as we now get into the summer and think about implementation, is this anti-diversity in local government bill. Part of a campaign we've heard from this administration for a number of years. They want to, quote unquote, make Florida the place where DEI goes to die. And their rationale was that local government is sort of one of the last bastions where they see this DEI that they're so scared of. The challenge here is that they applied a very broad and sweeping definition of DEI that both encompasses a lot and also has a lot of vagueness in terms of leaving folks unsure about just what the boundaries are. But overall, it was pertaining to a wide swath of activities, programs, funding on the basis of race, color, sex, ethnicity, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And as mentioned, it's a bill that we fought for 2 years, secured some really crucial carve-outs. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about some of those areas. But it has the potential for really dramatic impacts. It does void existing policies that would fall within this definition of DEI. And importantly, there were some really sort of hostile enforcement mechanisms here that we don't usually see in bills. First, it allows any city or county resident to bring a lawsuit. That's not the usual standard. Usually you've got to suffer some kind of particular harm because of the legislation, not just be a resident. And the potential penalty for any local elected who is engaging in this so-called prohibited DEI could be removed from office by the governor. We have seen where the governor has removed duly elected officials from office before. So particularly when that sort of implementation extremism gets mashed up with this vagueness, we're worried, and now we're on high alert and reaching out to a lot of our local government partners to help them understand the bounds of this bill and make sure that, again, in that sort of vagueness, it is not having a chilling effect where we see overcompliance and people just pulling back because of their fear of the bill. Most immediately, and particularly if y'all are hearing anything about this and having conversations in your communities about the bill now, it was just recently signed by the governor. It does not actually go into effect until January 1 of 2027. That may not sound that far off, but that actually is a delayed effective date from most laws that usually go into effect over the summer, which also means it has no impact over things like the summer pride season, anything up until January 1st. So if you're hearing about changes that local governments may be making now, please don't hesitate to call us in, because we would love to have that conversation with them and do some of that public education. And so first, I mentioned that this bill is so sweeping because of the way that they've broadly defined DEI. You can see the three sort of components here. The first one deals mostly with sort of affirmative action and hiring type issues. Clearly something that was a sticking point for the bill sponsors. They focused a lot of their narrative on that. But most all of the discussion that we saw in committee, from questions and public testimony, what was getting media coverage, was related to this second and third components of the definition. When you talk about anything that, quote unquote, promotes or provides preferential treatment or special benefits, well, what is a special benefit? Or when they talked about any training, programming, or activity designed or implemented with reference to these bases, you can see just how broadly that may sweep. And it's something that, again, our local governments are contending with now. It is, I think, so broad by design so that folks don't quite know where the boundaries are. I mean, we've already heard an example of a local government that was planning to pull back their Earth Day recognition because of this law. We can all state that there's absolutely, unquestionably nothing in this law that would impact recognizing Earth Day, but that is their goal, to sort of have this broad outsized impact. Excuse me. That's why it's really important that we have all of these carve-outs, but our count more than 24 exceptions to this sweeping legislation. So anything that requires compliance with state and federal laws, this does not supersede that, of course. And I'll go through these kind of quickly, but happy to, again, take questions at the end or talk about more specific examples. Also, a big place that we see, quote unquote, DEI from local governments are things like recognizing holidays, special observances, whether that is memes they're posting, a holiday parade that they're facilitating, what have you. Fortunately, we have carve-outs for holidays and special observances dedicated by state and federal law. You can see a couple examples on the slide. And also, quote unquote, patriotic and national observances. This is actually a pretty important and separate exemption, in that it is not just those specific observances like Asian and Pacific Heritage Month or Hispanic Heritage Month, but it is also the events and individuals forming the basis for those. So our allies in the legislature really went to bat on this bill, asked a lot of tough questions on it, and helped establish a great legislative record, so that when you have things like Hispanic Heritage Month that is clearly recognized in law, but then any events and individuals forming the basis of that, we got commitments from the bill sponsors saying that that does mean a local government could still support something like a Hispanic music festival or the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. So those are much broader than just the idea of a specific holiday. Similarly, at the bottom of the page, you can see this reference to certain monuments, memorials, and museums that are recognized in state law. Again, things like the Florida Black History Museum should clearly give coverage for recognizing Black History Month, even though that's not in state or federal law. So again, if that's a place that you're seeing questions or hearing local governments step back saying they don't want to do something, very much worth reaching out to us. We're happy to have that conversation. A couple more examples here worth noting. One of our outstanding advocates in the Senate, Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith, worked really directly with the bill sponsors to make sure that there was an exemption for continued operation and funding of Orlando's Pulse Memorial. We also did see some carve-outs for particular nonprofits that are, working on the basis of sex, in that they are, focused on sort of single-sex programs. One of the really important takeaways that we're trying to drive home, again, please help us get this message out there if you're hearing questions, is around prides. What became really clear is that the bill sponsors did not want to create any exceptions or couldn't think of any exceptions that would more broadly be inclusive of LGBTQ events in the LGBTQ community. But they did have to say that local governments can still issue event permits in a content neutral manner, meaning they can't discriminate based on the group seeking a permit. So again, they established very clearly that Pride is not banned. Local governments can still issue a permit for Pride, even if they can't, directly cut a check to subsidize that event, or if there are some restrictions on how they promote it. And also that they can continue to provide in-kind law enforcement support, which we know is very important for a lot of our prides and other sort of festivals. A few other factors here where there are carve-outs. Public health was another issue that we really pushed back hard on because we know there are so many compelling bases for why our county public health departments or public health systems differentiate their services based on community needs. One here especially is responding to certain health disparities recognized in law. And there is an express provision there around targeted minority outreach when it comes to HIV and AIDS. We know the disproportionate impact of HIV and AIDS on the LGBTQ community. And so it's really important to make sure that those sort of services can continue being delivered in a safe and effective manner. Also worth noting, the bill doesn't apply to non-elected volunteer bodies. So there are a couple like LGBTQ advisory boards around the state. Where I am in the Panhandle, I think all the way down to Monroe County and the Keys, a number of counties have commissions on the status of women, all those sorts of activities, and the administrative support for them remain permissible, even under the broad sweep of the law. I will also say, if we go back to the definition, remember where it talks about sort of any programming designed or implemented with reference to race, sex, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity. It does not include things like disability status. It doesn't include religion. It doesn't include age. So there are a couple of sort of things that folks might generally think of as DEI that are not within the scope of the bill. And again, it's going to be our responsibility to work with local governments and make sure that they are not over complying here and applying it where it shouldn't be. So I'm going to pass it back to Quinn, but happy to answer questions towards the end if there are any questions on that.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to get into some of the bills. I have the easy job of talking about the bills that we were able to defeat this legislative session. And so one of our biggest threats, and this was a really dangerous anti-transgender bill, we called More Lawsuits for Teachers and Doctors, that would, as we all may know, gender affirming care for youth has been prohibited under Florida state law since May 2023. This bill attempted to add really severe criminal and civil penalties to the folks who kind of assisted youth or their families access that prohibited care by creating a new crime called aiding and abetting access to that prohibited care. It also really weaponized the Attorney General's office. And of course, as you may know, the Attorney General has been incredibly anti-LGBTQ since he was first appointed to the position about a year and a half ago. He's now running for re-election for the first time. So he's really leaning into LGBTQ issues in a bad way. And so this bill would have just handed him sweeping authority to investigate, harass, and sue pretty much anyone at a certain point who was helping in the provision of this care. So as originally filed, the House and the Senate versions of these bills did differ. The House bill really only focused on healthcare providers and, in a broad way, of course, it really touched any type of healthcare provider under the sun, including acupuncturists, like anyone who is really licensed to provide any type of care under Florida general laws, where the Senate version really kind of had a more mild approach to the healthcare provider provision, but also swept in public schools into the law. So we saw the Senate bill move, but just through one committee. But we really saw the House bill move. And as it continued through the process, it only got worse. So in the bill's I can't remember if it was the second or final committee hearing in the House side. The bill sponsor, I think it was the third, the bill sponsor actually amended the bill to expand the aiding and abetting crime to capture anyone who may have assisted that young person access care. And again, the definition of care was so broad that the sponsor actually indicated in a committee hearing that, yeah, this would actually include parents driving their children to therapy appointments. It was incredibly dangerous, but it was kind of the type of situation where the sponsor had made the bill so bad and so politically toxic that other members of the legislature, they did not co-sign or support criminalizing access to mental health care. And that really became the red line on this bill. So while it did pass one Senate committee, and it passed all three of its assigned House committees, it was never scheduled for a final vote on the House floor, and that kind of ended its trajectory. John Harris?
Yeah, if I can add one thing, this bill illustrated what to me was one of the great themes of this session, and that was the importance of having the right messengers. And so for this bill that again touched on uh, the gender affirming care ban for minors and some of this enforcement of schools provisions, it really was like our cohort of Parenting with Pride parents and advocates talking directly to lawmakers about their experience and their fears that I think really changed those hearts and minds. We saw senators respond to that in real time in committee, talk to folks, in their office afterwards. And, Quinn and I think are very fortunate to have jobs we love, and we get to, represent Equality Florida, deliver the talking points, help, set the record for litigation if there are legal challenges. But it's so different when folks are just there in their personal capacities, and the lawmakers understand that distinction too, knowing how people, take their time and come travel to the Capitol and engage in this system. And so in this case, I think it really was those parents and families that were such compelling messengers. We talked about the anti-DEI law, and we facilitated a number of city and county commissioners coming up to the Capitol to testify, hosting their own press conference that again really helped, I think, drive home the impact there. And we'll talk a little bit again about the AIDS drug assistance program funding fight. And there it was having those ADAP clients in the room talking about their personal experience. So if you or any of your, friends and colleagues helped with those conversations, they were so invaluable. And it's something that really sticks out to me when I think about this bill.
Yes. And on that, something that I did forget to mention on the how we showed up and fought back slide is that our first week of Pride at the Capitol was actually dedicated towards like parents and families. And so, as Jen mentioned in the chat, we had so many families who were with us in Tallahassee that first week of our Pride at the Capitol kickoff. And actually, I think it was the first day of our first week. This bill was scheduled for a hearing in both the House and the Senate at the same exact time. And so we had to reshuffle our whole agenda for our Pride at the Capitol program, but it was incredible because we had 75, 100 parents and families all come to these committee hearings, one in the House, one in the Senate, pack the rooms and then tell those really meaningful personal stories. So it was just incredible. So again, thank you to everyone who joined us in Tallahassee this year. And let's go on to the next bill, which is the Don't Say Gay or Trans at Work bill. And so this is a refile from 2025. And this bill, again, it's another dangerous anti-transgender bill. What it really it's kind of like a pronoun regulation bill. It basically would have prevented public employees from requiring their colleagues, their supervisors from using the correct and affirming pronouns if their pronouns did not align with their sex assigned at birth. In addition to regulating pronouns in public workplaces and also some private workplaces that contract with the state, this bill was also going to prohibit mandatory workplace trainings that touch on topics that include sexual orientation and gender identity. But because it was so broad, we were so concerned that this would sweep into, general anti-harassment or non-discrimination trainings in workplaces. That would just make all of Florida's workplaces a little less safe, and it would impact major companies that do business in Florida. And so this bill, again, similar trajectory to the previous one. It cleared one of its three assigned committee committees of reference in the Senate. It passed all three committees of reference in the House, but it was, ready for a floor vote, and it was just never placed on that House floor agenda. So another dangerous bill. We've defeated it 2 years in a row now. Really hoping it doesn't come back next year, but we will see. Pride flag ban bill. This is actually the fourth year in a row that this one has been filed. This would have prohibited public buildings from raising a pride flag. Now, of course, we have talked about the anti-diversity law, which prohibits certain activities, but this bill would have touched so many more public buildings that are covered by the anti-diversity law. So, while we are not talking about flags on buildings under the anti-diversity bill yet, this potentially creates some difficulty for counties and municipalities there. However, because it didn't pass, the anti-diversity bill, as mentioned in the chat, doesn't impact public schools. This would have had potential ramifications for public schools and a whole host of other public buildings. This did not receive a hearing in either branch, which we were very surprised by because last year it really had momentum in the Senate, which was a surprise for us. Never received a hearing on the House side, but for the fourth year in a row, we were able to defeat this bill. So there is still the possibility of pride flags on certain public buildings. Outside of those county and municipal government buildings, of course. So next slide. Book ban expansion law. This, as we all may be familiar with, Florida does lead the nation in the number of books pulled from public school shelves. We passed an original book banning law a couple sessions ago, but for the past two legislative sessions, the sponsors have been trying to just make it easier for books to be removed from public school shelves. And so the way that this bill would have worked would have prevented the review committees that are responsible for making the ultimate determination about whether a book remains on the shelf. It would have prevented those committees from considering the whole educational value of a work. So you may be familiar with some school board meetings where parents get up and read really chosen excerpts from books in a way to maybe generate support for pulling that book off the shelf. But when you fail to consider a material's entire value, artistic value, educational, scientific value, literary value, you're really not giving that book a fair shot. And so we've actually seen, of course, science books be pulled off shelves under the existing law, and that was before it was ever going to be expanded. So this bill actually did pass the entire House floor for the second year in a row, cleared all of its committees. This year it only had two, last year it had three. So it did seem like they were trying to expedite the passage of the bill in the House. However, it did receive three committees of reference in the Senate, and it never received a Senate hearing. So that was good news for this bill. It's status quo for now, despite the fact that we remain the state with the most books removed from shelves. And I think I've got a couple more. Yep. Endangering Our Kids Act. So this was a bill that we worked really closely with some of our LGBTQ partners on and Planned Parenthood. And it would have really put young people at risk by restricting access to STI treatment, mental health crisis intervention services, and other healthcare without parental consent. Now, we know that we cannot legislate perfect communication in every home, but we also know that when young people are willing and able to take the steps necessary to take control of their health in these ways, whether it's, you've been tested for an STI, now you want to treat that STI or what may be, it just makes more sense to allow treatment to occur because we know that like a single case does not stay isolated in communities. It can impact us all. And so when young people are, wanting the agency to take their health into their hands when they're 17, 18, they should be able to do so. And so this bill, it has seen many iterations. As originally filed, it would have prevented access to birth control and STI testing. Both of those provisions have been removed. So it really focused on the STI treatment, which really made no sense to me. But kind of same thing. We saw movement on the House. We saw this clear two out of its three assigned committees, and it never received a hearing in the Senate. So good news on this bill too. I think that might be it for me. Yes, back over to John Harris.
It is worth noting as we do that sort of tour of a parade of horribles, there are actually good ideas out there in the legislature. So these are some of the proactive bills. We won't go through them in detail, but just worth noting, I mean, our champions are out there. They are putting forward the vision of the Florida that we all deserve and should have. There are, places here where we see real opportunity and remain hopeful that we can advance some of these policies because they are so common sense in terms of being able to better life for all Floridians and or address some of the existing harms in Florida law, including some of them that have been recently passed that should be removed. So we can save that for another time, but there is a lot out there that folks are proactively championing. I also wanted to talk about the fight around ADAP, as mentioned. This was not on our radar going into legislative session when I talked about sort of what our expectations were coming back to the Capitol. In January, word broke that the Department of Health, or really word sort of started leaking out that the Department of Health was proposing to institute these massive cuts to the ADAP program, impacting something like 16,000 Floridians. ADAP helps provide direct medication and insurance coverage for some of the most vulnerable Floridians. As it exists, the program applies for an eligibility threshold of 400% of the federal poverty line, and they were looking at reducing that down to 130% based on alleged budget shortfalls, which were highly contested. But what became clear is that because of tremendous advocacy from folks living with HIV, including ADAP clients, that there was some will in the legislature to address this shortfall, even when the Department of Health was not doing anything about it, had not sought additional funding to make up for the losses that they were projecting. But part of the challenge was that those budgetary fixes would only happen in the next fiscal year, starting July 1st. And they were proposing these drastic cuts starting in March. That was going to leave folks tremendously, in the gap, even if the legislature did come back and fix something in the budget. So ultimately, with a lot of bipartisan support, really, there was significant stopgap funding secured that allows us to keep that 400% eligibility threshold. Now, it is not a restoration of the ADAP coverage as it entirely existed previously. Basically, ADAP is largely driven by federal funding, and that has been sort of flat funded for more than a decade as costs have increased. Losing some of the Obamacare insurance subsidies has made the program much more difficult to fund. So even as they have had the stopgap emergency funding there to address the eligibility threshold, they're no longer covering things like the Biktarvy medication, which is a 1 pill a day regimen, highly effective, and having to switch to generics is not just, swapping out for the exact same thing that's not name brand. The alternatives are more burdensome sort of compliance regimens in terms of the number and frequency of pills that you have to take. There are more complications, more side effects. So there's a lot of work more to be done there. Quinn and I are actually both in Tallahassee this week because a special session starts tomorrow addressing several issues, and then they will be back in May to address the budget for next fiscal year, because while that is the one bill they are required to pass by law, they did not. So remains to be seen what more we can do in at least next year's budget, but worth taking at least a victory lap on that stopgap funding to avert what truly would be a crisis of care. And just so grateful for advocates like Michael Rayner, you can see on the slide there, and some of our AIDS service organizations, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, who really showed up and pushed back against the Department of Health's proposed cuts and demanded a lot more transparency than was being given. And then, frankly, I think the public is owed. So a strong first chapter in the fight, but far from the end of the story. So with that, happy to set aside some time for questions. Or Jennifer, I don't know if you have any announcements and things you want to get through first, but we appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you. That was great. I took a couple little notes of things that I wanted to make sure that I pointed out. A lot of those bills that we stopped really, as parents and caregivers, just a reminder how those really would have affected us. Things that don't, the flag ban doesn't sound like, oh, is that a big deal? We know, we hear from our kids how important it is for them when they're in school to see a teacher that has a pin, on their lanyard, or has a flag, small flag on their desk. And so one of those things, that y'all stopped really would have been detrimental to a lot of our kids. Same thing, our book bans, that is unbelievable that they were trying to expand something that is already really hurting our kids. And I love all your suggestions of like, what can you do? A lot of times parents are like, do they really make a difference? All those phone calls or those emails, like, does it make a difference? And when you showed that slide with those numbers on there, it does. And so I just want folks to know, we'd love for you to come to Tallahassee. Pride at the Capitol is just a moment. We love that we did it, for parents and families this year in a specific time. Can't wait to do it next year. By the way, next year's session starts in March. It's not in January, which is helpful after the holidays. But there's so many ways for you to advocate for yourself, for your family, and for your community. So I just kind of wanted to put that. I see there is a question in the chat, John Harris. Can some of the bad bills be brought back in the special session? Raymond, that's a great question.
It is a great question. The special session is actually sort of more controlled than a regular session. They have to give specific bases for calling the special session. So in the case of the special session that's starting this week, the only topics for it are congressional redistricting, which is by no means a small issue, an AI bill, and this quote unquote medical freedom bill. It's worth noting on that medical freedom issue, that is not a bill that we were focused on during session. That was the expansion of the healthcare license to discriminate bill. That's the unfortunately existing legislation around refusal to provide care or cover care if you're an insurer that you have a moral, religious, or ethical objection to. Again, lots of vagueness there. So they were looking to expand that provision during the regular session. That does not fall within sort of the scope of the special session. Quinn and I are still going to be in the building just to make sure they don't try any sneaky amendments. But like of the bills that we've covered here, we don't have any expectation that those are going to be revived this week.
Great question. John Harris, another one. Wondering what your general expectations are for the next legislative session, just as rough. You want to take that?
It is $1 million question that just feels far too early to answer. Certainly, Florida has seen a rightward lurch in recent legislative sessions, but we've also had some really great special election results lately. And keeping this out of a partisan space, I will say those special elections have resulted in more pro-LGBTQ candidates entering office. So I think in terms of their support for LGBTQ equality, we saw 2 seats flip, one in the Senate and one in the House. So those are really encouraging. And I think even as, one more House seat out of a 120 member body does not dramatically change the dynamics of that chamber, it does have an impact. And I think lawmakers, wherever they are on the spectrum of LGBTQ support, see what is working or what is not in different constituencies. And, results like that can only help us. I hope that remains true of the general election and that we see just as much of a shift towards more pro-equality lawmakers. I'm encouraged by that. And we'll just have to see. We will have a new leadership sort of team in the House and Senate. And even that is tough to predict. As I alluded to briefly, in 2025, I feel like the House Speaker was really helpful to us. And, because a lot of this is very top-down controlled. The fact that no anti-LGBTQ bills got a hearing, the House Speaker has to have played a role in that. And then this past session, the exact same person in that position of power, we saw a tremendous number of bills get a hearing. So I think it just goes to sort of the uncertainty of the legislative process. There's some positive signs out there. I'm putting my hope on those for now, and we'll be showing up in the Capitol to do the battle, whatever it is.
Thank you, John Harris. So here's another question. Gretchen asked, since the Equality Florida lawsuit, how can I say it? Don't Say Gay was settled with the state, have you seen school district boards making efforts to let teachers and parents know that the law still is on the books, but some restrictions have been lifted? I'll actually take that one because that's kind of what we're doing. Yes. So when we got that settlement agreement, that was really huge because really what we found was, while we knew what the law was, which was you can't, teach this in curriculum, and that really is all it says, the vagueness of it, we know had tremendous effects in our schools. And so once we got that settlement agreement, I know personally that I have, with our Safe and Healthy team, have been going around and making sure that folks do know what their rights are. What are your rights as parents for your kids in the school? What are your rights as a teacher? So I think that the more we can spread the word, the more that we can get folks engaged and let them know, because the truth is we have so many rights. And whenever I go and do a parent summit and we talk about it, and we have a big one coming up in July, I always have a legal panel, because the more we can inform parents and let them know you have a right for your child to have a safe learning environment that is not against the law in Florida. And you have the right for your child to be called by their firm name. We now have forms that we didn't have before. So there are a lot of different nuances that I think many people don't know. So yes, Gretchen, we hope to get that message out. We do trainings. Our Safe and Healthy Schools team do trainings with teachers, kind of outside of the school setting, letting them know, because our teachers are our heroes. Our teachers are with our kids every single day. And I always say, as a parent of a child in the public school system, I'm depending on those adults, the principal, administrators, teachers, to keep my child safe, and to make sure that he has the same opportunity as every other child in that school. And so we want to make sure that we are supporting them, and we're giving them the knowledge and letting them know that we are here to support them and what their rights really are. So thank you for that question. We're doing our best. We're doing our best to get that message out. And I love when I do tell parents and I let them know, especially those who have gender inclusive guides in their counties. We have 67 school county districts. We have about 12 of them that have these guides, and so many parents don't know they exist. And I always say, like, this is your Bible. This has been approved by the state, by your school board attorneys, by your school board, and make sure that you know that these are your rights. So if you are in a school district that has one, you should be familiar with it, because it really does help give you the power to make sure that you are that you're protected. So thank you for that
Thank
question.
you very much. How do you know if your district has that guide?
What district are you in? I might know.
Pinellas County.
Yeah, Pinellas does have it. Absolutely. And if you'd like to reach out to me separately, I'll put my email in there. Sometimes, I'm not going to lie, they make it a little bit hard to find, but you should be able to find it on their website. It's kind of embedded sometimes under like bullying policies and stuff, but yeah, Pinellas has one. And those are great. Each district's guides look very different. The legal team does, look at them. And so the language is a little bit different, but basically they're all based on the settlement agreement. And so they have dress code in there, bathrooms in there, pronouns, names, all of that are in the guides. And even if your district doesn't have one, doesn't mean that you don't still have those protections.
Right. Thank you very much.
Of course. All right, I see another question in there from Maya. I saw that there was a bill or two about healthcare. Do any of those have an effect on health insurance coverage for adult trans care? My insurance, Florida Blue, has a planned exclusion for trans care and stopped covering my HRT. It would not cover gender affirming surgery. Is that in their legal rights? I'm going to turn that over to the legal experts.
Well, I know that nothing that passed this legislative session touches on those issues. And my only thought, John Harris, is the license to discriminate in healthcare law that was passed in 2023 that allows folks to choose groups of services that they either will cover or exclude. But maybe John Harris has more insight.
Yeah, I do think that they are probably within their legal rights to have that exclusion while we disagree with them operating their policy that way. I don't know that they could be compelled to offer that. It's worth noting, I mean, to get a little into the nuance of things like the license to discriminate in healthcare bill. I mean, clearly, private companies have a lot of leeway to do whatever they want when it comes to things like insurance, cover whatever they are or are not willing to cover. We're always surprised whether it's healthcare or a homeowner's policy, right? Like things that you would think they should cover and don't. But specifically worth knowing for that license to discriminate in healthcare, it has to be, this is one of the things we got clarified in the language and on the record, it has to be about an opposition to that healthcare service, not the patient. So in practice, what that should look like is if you have a plastic surgeon who is doing mastectomies for cancer patients, then they should be doing top surgeries as well for trans patients. They're not allowed to object to it just because it is part of gender affirming care if they otherwise don't have any sort of objection to performing that sort of service or that form of care. And, they can say, we're not covering any of this type of care. So I'm sorry I can't give a more detailed answer, but also happy to connect you with legal resources that may have more expertise or may better know what questions to ask so you can figure out, how specific is that denial. And I will say to Jennifer Solomon's point on some of what's happening in our schools, there was a sort of quiet victory today where the U.S. Supreme Court declined to take up a case from a Leon County challenge to the school district there, where you had a non-binary student being supported by teachers and then, parents opposed to some of what they saw happening in the schools. And that sort of parent plaintiff has been trying to take advantage of the courts for a while to advance their case and has lost repeatedly. And now, again, the U.S. Supreme Court also declined to sort of side with them.
That's a big win. I actually didn't even know that happened today. That's a big win. Thank you, John Harris. Well, we are getting, oh, perfect. I'm going to look that up. Thank you for being there. We are getting closer to the end, but we still have time if anyone else has any questions. I want to let you all know about what is coming up next for Parenting with Pride. So we normally do our monthly webinars like this, but for the next 2 months, we have a program called out of Brazelton. It's called Touch Points. It's actually out of Boston Children's Hospital area over there. And it is a family to family real talk series. So instead of doing one webinar a month, we're going to be doing 2. And we actually are going to be having more of a national audience. And we will be running them. Parenting with Pride will be running them. And our first one is going to be on May 6th. It's a little bit earlier than we do our normal ones. We usually do 6 to 7 Eastern Standard Time. This is 5 to 6 because we have folks in California and we really couldn't do it. We were trying to accommodate everyone. And so rather than doing it that late, it was kind of hard for folks. We are doing it from 5 to 6. Y'all will get that information in our next newsletter, which will go out next week. But the first one that we have, I'm very excited for those of you that have been on our webinars before. I tried to look at what are some things that that were really positive, that I know I got really good feedback. I know personally that I've used. And one of the things is communication. I think right now, especially in our country, it's so hard to have those difficult conversations. And so the Yes Institute, which is here in Miami, they have an incredible program called Communication Solutions. I've actually taken it years ago at the very beginning of my journey as a parent, and it helped me so much. How do you have conversations with folks that maybe don't think like you think, or if you're trying to talk about your child, and having either within your family or situations where you're just really not getting the information across. So they are going to kick off our series on May 6th. It is called Pride in Every Word. So it is a Pride series because we'll have 2 in May, 2 in June. And I hope you all will join us. I will be sending out a follow-up that will have a link to this webinar, and also so y'all can sign up, and it's going to be really exciting. The next one that we do in May, later in May, it'll be on May 20th. We're going to be talking about mental health, and then we'll have 2 in June, and I've got really fun, exciting folks that are going to be on there, and so I hope will join us. Do we have any final words, John Harris, Quinn, on I wish we could say wrapping up the sessions, and I feel terrible because when we scheduled this, this will be great. We'll kind of be able to put 2026 legislative session to rest. And unfortunately, y'all are still in Tallahassee fighting the fight, and we do appreciate that. But any final thoughts on maybe the first half or the major part of the legislative session?
Yeah, I mean, we will be here continuing to be vigilant, but just gratitude. I mean, really, it's so phenomenal to have folks come up to the Capitol and be with us in Tallahassee. And even if you can't make the trip to Tallahassee, which we know is onerous, over the summer and through the fall, those meetings that you can do in district, just remembering that these are your lawmakers who are supposed to be responsive to you, you are their constituents, whether you voted for them or not. And it really is so impactful for them to hear how these policies are really impacting families and their communities. So really appreciate you being here to hear a little bit more about it, and happy to be a resource. But Quinn?
Yeah, I think my ending thought is, it's obviously hard to live under very cruel laws and policies, right? And I moved down here from Massachusetts, like right before all the really bad anti-LGBTQ bills were passed in 2023. But I think what's really motivating about this work in an especially difficult climate is that, we lean on each other in such important ways. Like our relationships here matter so much. And we're really all forced to think creatively and differently about what it takes to just move through the world under these circumstances. And so I think for me, despite how difficult it can be in this environment, I always am very encouraged by the folks that I am working with or hearing from, because it takes a lot to stay and fight and give everything you have to the state that's not giving anything back to you. And so despite how difficult and grueling the legislative session was, and I really hope that next year is not like this one, I am very encouraged by everyone's fight, and I feel like I become a better advocate just by working in such close partnership under these conditions with all of y'all. So thank you so much.
Thank y'all. I love it. And you know what? You're right. I mean, it takes a village. And I always say, people, when I tell them I'm in Florida, they're like, why do you stay? And I say, this is where we chose to raise our family. This is where, I grew up, and, our kids, we are getting creative. Our kids are, doing well. We are making sure that we are finding ways, and we're actually leaders in this country, because we get calls all the time for folks in those blue states that are now starting to see very similar legislative attacks on their families. And they really are looking to Florida because we've kind of figured it out, right? They're like, oh, they're doing a kids in sport, girls in sports. It's like, oh yeah, we did that years ago. And so they are definitely looking to see how we have figured out how to make sure that this is still a place that we want to live and raise our family. So thank you to everyone that is on tonight. And thank you to our presenters. I really do appreciate you. And I hope to see everybody at our touch points. Again, it's a Zoom webinar, very similar, but it's just giving you a heads up. It might have a little bit of a different look, but we're really excited to be partnering with folks on the national level. So I hope to see you there. Take care, everyone.